This week on the Writers Detective Bureau, episode 100. I can't believe we've already made it to 100 episodes. I recorded this as a 3.5-hour long Facebook Live in the Writers Detective Q&A Facebook group. And then I distilled many of the questions and answers from that down into what you're listening to now and what will also be episode 101. If you haven't already done so, come join us in the Facebook group. Just go to writersdetectivebureau.com/Facebook, answer a few quick questions so I know you're a real person and not a spam bot, and then you'll be approved. Since we covered a whole gamut of topics, rather than try to summarize every one at the top of the show like I normally do, what do you say we just get right into the questions? First question. How soon will a medical examiner rule a drowning a homicide? And, of course, it popped off the screen right after that. And trying to tighten the storyline and increase the pace. Good question. I mean, honestly, that's one of those things that you can kind of play with as far as your timeline. Now, so whether they have it be a homicide as far as manner of death, they'll rule it not a suicide. They'll rule it a drowning pretty quickly. That will be pretty obvious based on what they find during the autopsy. They will probably have to talk to the police detective that's doing the investigation to actually learn whether it's a homicide or not. So there's going to be some communication between the two. Obviously, coming in, it's just going to look like the obvious thing for a drowning would be accidental. So in that case, if the police were involved and there was that kind of particular possibility, going back to the last episode where I talked about manner of death, cause of death, and mechanism of death, they might actually, there's actually one more classification I didn't add to the list when we talked about it in the podcast, just because I didn't want to confuse anyone, but there's actually a pending manner of death. So they can essentially say, we aren't going to disclose or make a final decision on whether it's going to be murder or homicide, not murder, homicide versus accident versus suicidal, that kind of thing. So they would probably leave it as a pending thing while that investigation was going, and then kind of go from there as far as making that final determination. And really where that final determination comes is when they're issuing the death certificate at when all of this is over. And it can take, it can take a month for a death certificate to actually be filed. If there's a pending investigation, it can be longer than that, which, a lot of times the death certificate is, needed for things like getting the claim money from a life insurance policy. So if that's pending, where there's a possibility of it being a suicide potentially, obviously all of that needs to get figured out before the insurance company is going to pay out on it. So, and then of course, all the other stuff that comes with closing out the obligations of a person when they're no longer around, like credit and that kind of stuff. So yeah, as far as the determination of it being a drowning, it's going to be pretty quick, pretty much upon the end of that autopsy. And the majority of these reports that the forensic pathologist does I'm not sure whether or not they're all video recorded. Where I work, they are, but they audio record, or at least they transcribe. They do they dictate. That's the word I'm looking for. They dictate their reports as they are doing the examination itself. So as they're, not to get gross, but an autopsy, they're pulling organs out and they're taking tissue samples and they're weighing every organ. And so they're literally going to be calling out, 200 grams for this thing, and in explaining exactly what they're doing as they're doing it. And then ultimately someone else will transcribe it, and then that's where the report comes from. So, but then as far as the homicide thing, that will definitely be more contingent upon the detectives that are working that investigation. So living in SoCal, you're well acquainted with wildland fire. In fact, you have fires burning at the moment. Unfortunately, my question is, when a wildfire has been determined by fire investigators to be a human cause and deliberately set as opposed to negligence, putting out a campfire, who then takes over to track down the arsonist? If U.S. Forest Service investigates, do they contact state law enforcement or federal Do they contact ATF? When does ATF come into the picture? Great questions, Lois. So U.S. Forest Service actually has investigators. So your arson investigators, I know we already have experts in here, so please chime in if I misspeak here. But the arson investigators are really the subject matter experts, as you know, as far as determining that it was a fire that was intentionally set and finding and locating the evidence for that kind of stuff. But Forest Service does have its own law enforcement agents. And if it happened in a federal forest, then it's going to be a federal crime. So the U.S. Forest Service, whoever the arson investigator is for the Forest Service, may do this on their own. I'm not entirely sure, but I know that they have their own federal law enforcement agents for U.S. Forest Service. So they would then go to the U.S. attorney once they have a suspect identified and try to get an arrest warrant or search warrants that way. As far as ATF will get involved when it's explosive related for the most part. So ATF is actually BATFE, so the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. So more often than not, they're getting involved if there's some sort of bomb-making incendiary device as opposed to I guess technically it would be an incendiary device versus an explosive device. So incendiary device would be the arson investigators. Explosive device would be the ATF. And then also for post-blast, like if it's a true like ANFO explosion, that kind of thing. Ammonium nitrate and fuel oil. So the kind of explosion that we saw with the Oklahoma City bombing, which is basically fertilizer and diesel. Then you may also get the FBI involved as well. They have a huge post-blast expertise program as well, and they work pretty closely. So I hope that helps. And then tracking down the arsonist, to finish up your question, Lois, that would be whoever was doing that actual law enforcement investigation. And once they have that warrant, technically they could also task, like if they had information that he was outside of the local area of where that Forest Service is, anytime you have a federal warrant in play, you could task the U.S. Marshals with that as well. But most people want to be able to catch their own bad guy. So Dan says, in my story, an exhibit in a museum is messed with, but not actually damaged. Does that count as vandalism? And can you talk about how a department would investigate it, if at all? No. So for vandalism, when I've talked in the past about corpus delicti, which is essentially the body, like the parts of a crime that you need to prove in order for that crime the alleged crime to lead to probable cause and then end up getting an arrest. For vandalism, it needs to be permanent damage. There may be some other kind of section where if it's, I don't know, if like some sort of tampering, may be like there may be some random section of law somewhere that talks about some sort of exhibit tampering or something like that. Like here in California, we have just as an example, we have a section in the vehicle code for a stolen vehicle, for literally taking a car, stealing it, and driving away. Vehicle burglary, which would be breaking into a locked car. We have petty theft, which would be breaking into an unlocked car. So you pull the door handle, it's unlocked, you go in, you steal something. That's petty theft, or it could be grand theft, depending on what you steal. But then we also have a section of the vehicle code that's vehicle tampering. So if I'm watching someone walk down the street and they're pulling door handles, and even if they don't actually go inside the vehicle, break the plane of the vehicle, I can still go after them for vehicle tampering because that's its own crime. Just like vandalism would be, like if you broke the mirror off the car, that would be causing permanent damage to it. So it depends on what laws are on the books. So I would do some research into the kind of laws that could apply to a museum and could apply to some sort of tampering. I'm not sure which state you're setting your story in, Dan, but you might try looking up your code, state code, and searching for the word tampering and see which sections pop up. And Carl says, love the podcast. Thank you, Carl. And am I aware of any cases? I have to sit up a little higher so I can be visible. Aware of any cases where a murder was committed and then the murder assumed the deceased person's identity What ways might the killer be tracked? I don't, off the top of my head, know of any specific cases. I do know of cases where people have assumed identities of people that are dead. Normally, that's ones where they become aware of someone that died as a child, and then they just someone who was old enough to have had a social security number issued to them along with that birth certificate, and then for whatever reason, the death certificate didn't match up to that social security. So there's no necessarily a record of them dying when it comes to notification to the credit bureaus. This was more back in the late 90s, early 2000s, where people weren't quite as hip to the identity theft issues that we have now. I was literally listening to a jail phone call in one of my investigations. It was back when I worked fraud cases, where this guy was talking his girlfriend, like on the recorded phone line from the jail, walking his girlfriend through the process of looking up the identity of this person who had died and was listed. I don't know if it's still available or not, but you used to be able to look up the Social Security Death Index. I know you can still do that, but look up a specific name and it would actually list their Social Security number as well as the zip code of where their last known residence was, or their last known Social Security payment was. So this guy had found someone who had passed away. Their name and their date of birth was on this website along with their Social Security number. And so he had opened up a line of credit and using this dead person's identity. And so he remembered the name, but he couldn't remember the Social Security number. And he knew that he had this line of credit with, $50,000 or whatever. So he's calling his girlfriend, asking her to look this up to get the Social Security number, because he was calling the bank, I'm not going to say which bank, essentially trying to bail himself out using the line of credit of this other person. And so, she rattles off the Social Security number, and then he hangs up the phone and he's, working to get that bail bond posted using this line of credit that was complete identity theft. And so I was able to call over to the jail and get them to not only stop that from happening, but then also add another charge and then, just bail enhancements and all that other kind of stuff. So crazy stuff. So for them to assume, Carl, their own, the murdered person's identity, it's certainly plausible, especially if the person has not been discovered. Like if the body has not been found, then, there's no death certificate, no way for the ways that we are tracked, on the private sector side of credit bureaus and all that kind of stuff that are going to find out that you're dead and then shut down your lines of credit. That's going to be a possibility for sure. So Garth asks, if a local police department in the U.S. finds that a crook has been smuggling in material from Canada, would they contact the U.S. Border Agency and or Canadian authorities, or would they just work the case on their own as a local PD? Great question. It depends, obviously, on what the material is. But yeah, they would, for a couple of reasons, because one of the exceptions to a search warrant, of being able to search someone without a warrant, is crossing a border. And so you have to have the authority to be able to do that. But if you were to contact Customs and Border Patrol or Homeland Security investigations, the next time that they were crossing that border, assuming illegally, let's say it's the Canadian border in one of those rural areas where there's no demarcation between Canada and the U.S., you're just walking through a field and you pop out the other side. If they were there and able to swoop in on them, they would not need a warrant to be able to detain them or to search them, because of the fact that crossing an international border, you are inherently subject to search. But yeah, they would. And they would probably work it together. They would work it together for whatever, let's say it's drugs, they would work it as a joint investigation. And then the border agency would talk about how they're going to go federal with them and all that kind of stuff. And then the put it all together, send it to the U.S. attorney, and unless it is ironclad, then they're going to say, let's have the locals prosecute it. And so the poor DA ends up with the leftovers. Realistically, though, for cases like that, the U.S. attorney would take it. It's going to be pretty obvious. So, yeah, they'd work it together. So Martel asks, do you think it's more realistic to apply team-based investigators to murder cases as opposed to just one or two detectives in a procedural story? Great question, Martel. It's been my experience that the one or two investigators tend to be in the larger cities where they have a huge homicide problem. So cities like San Francisco or Los Angeles, New York, Baltimore, Chicago, any place where you're seeing hundreds of homicides in a year, you're going to have one or two, if that. You may have one investigator and then their partner who has their own caseload is going to be helping them. Where the smaller agencies, where especially in suburban areas where there may be one every few years, or even one in a decade, they'll have every detective they have start working that case. I work in a smaller agency, so we tend to throw all of our detectives at it, and we will essentially take over the conference room in our detective bureau. Up goes all the writing on the dry erase boards, and they start tasking out pairs of detectives or single detectives to do certain things. And as a result, you get a much higher conviction rate or a much higher solvability rate, because in that classic 48 hours, those are the golden hours of an investigation where you're increasing the likelihood that you're going to solve it and get a conviction. The more people you can throw at this one case, the better. So it is definitely more realistic, especially if it is not a large agency, to make it a team thing. And so in that case, you may have a detective. We've talked in the podcast quite a bit about rank and what the jobs really are. So your detective sergeant may be the one who's saying, these two detectives are doing this, these two detectives are doing that. This detective is going to be at the crime scene. This detective is going to be, pulling phones. I mean, because there's a ton of things, there are, hundreds of things that will come up over the course of the investigation of little things that need to be followed up on. And in the very beginning, there's obviously going to be a checklist of very basic things that need to get accomplished. So, the more people you have, if one guy's going to an autopsy and another guy's still at the crime scene with forensics, it's like you need people to go out and knock on doors to look for witnesses, start canvassing for Ring doorbells, surveillance cameras. There's so many things that you can do. And if you get them done in that first 48 hours, it's going to make a huge difference on being able to solve that crime. That is the way you solve a case quickly and professionally and consistently, is by putting everybody that you can possibly put at it to make it work. How does your department select dog handlers? That's a great question. I think a lot of I'm trying to think of how they do it now. A lot of times, or at least when I started, because I was really interested in being a dog handler, especially right out of the academy. And so what I did to kind of garner the attention and kind of pay my dues was to volunteer to be the guy in the bite suit, and just volunteer to go to training. I was not putting in for overtime or trying to adjust time or any of that kind of stuff. It was just, hey, pick me up when you guys are going to do your training. Our department historically has used Wednesdays as their training days. And so, I would volunteer to be the guy in the bite suit. And that is quite an interesting experience, let me tell you. So I did that for quite a bit, actually. But then I ended up getting promoted to detective, so I was no longer working patrol. But I think the ones who put in that effort and also show some sort of, going above and beyond just saying you want to be a canine, pursuing your own expertise as far as dog training and obedience training and all that kind of stuff, and just kind of making yourself available to be used, I think. And there is a testing process for my department, but you're obviously going to do better on that selection testing if you have taken part in the training itself, rather than just having been a patrol guy, putting your name in the hat and, hoping you can kind of wing it on the testing. So as Emma writes, moral question, I write about vigilante pedophile hunters. In my books, the cops don't search too hard to find the vigilante. In reality, would police maybe not search as hard for them as they would some other criminals? That's going to be up to you. Realistically, you've got, assuming they're killing these guys, these pedophiles, how long until they're wrong, right? You're kind of ignoring the criminal justice aspect of innocent until proven guilty, right? So I think that they would become persona non grata pretty quickly if they ended up killing somebody or going after somebody who really wasn't a pedophile under a case of mistaken identity or, for whatever thing. But I'm sure there are plenty of cops who would kind of put on the back burner if they thought that they were kind of being a Dexter of ridding the world of bad people. But reality wise, I think that they would treat the vigilantes as bad guys just like the pedophiles. So they'd just be another person on the list to go after because they're, not playing by the rules. And TD says, do you think video recorders like Ring have helped solve cases faster? Can those videos be used in courts? Yes, I would say that they have, as well as the popularity now of DVR surveillance systems at home. Once they start selling them at Costco, they certainly become more prevalent. So we're getting, vehicle descriptions and all that kind of stuff a lot faster. And as long as normally it's the result of a canvas where, an officer or a detective is going out, finding them and knocking on the door and asking, for consent to get a copy. So it's hard to, I would imagine as a defense attorney, it might be kind of hard to fight that as evidence when it was voluntarily given to you by the homeowner, right? So the homeowner probably emails you the file and it's time and date stamped. So that's pretty damning evidence. So no, video evidence, whether that's surveillance cameras, Ring doorbells, body-worn cameras, is definitely not only solving crimes, but it's also becoming expected as a juror. Kind of like in the 2000s, everybody expected DNA to be part of the prosecution's evidence, and now people expect video. Just with the prevalence of cell phones alone. So it's definitely a growing trend for sure. Sheila says, I'm writing a book that deals with human trafficking. Does law enforcement use the app where hotel room pictures are uploaded to help find trafficking victims? I believe they do. I'm not sure to what extent, as far as I'm sure if it's a human trafficking task force or a unit, then yes. I don't know if a patrol officer or just if you're assigned to human trafficking, I'm sure they're using that app. I actually worked human trafficking as part of vice duties for quite a few years, but that was prior to the app and crowdsourcing that information. And it also depends on whether or not there are enough hotel room pictures in that city for where that's where your crime's going on, as far as whether it's going to be useful or not. But yeah, it's a tough thing to work. I'll leave it at that. But yeah, kudos to you, Sheila, for tackling that topic. Writers are fun. Writers really, I'm preaching to the choir here, right? But when you think about how much of what we see and consume out there really is the result of somebody sitting down to write, it's just you and your keyboard or you and your pen and getting all of these great ideas out onto paper or onto the screen, and having that turn into books, TV shows, music, poetry, video games. It's pretty amazing what you can create, and also the lifestyle potentially you can create for yourself just by having the, stick-to-itiveness to keep pushing out content and creating, essentially whatever's coming out of that head of yours. It's pretty fascinating. So being able to help you guys as best I can, it's certainly a privilege. Thank you so much for listening this week and getting the Bureau to 100 episodes. And if you were able to join me during the Facebook Live, thanks for being part of the making of episode 100 and episode 101. If you're partaking in NaNoWriMo right now, this is your reminder to get back to writing and crushing your word count. Thanks again for listening. Have a great week and write well.